All right, we're about a minute past. We'll go ahead and get going. Thank you for joining us today. We are covering, this is our quarterly webinar where we focus in on one of the themes that we think are driving what our new economy will look like. And today we're covering supply chain resiliency, but really we're getting into a lot of the buzzwords of what has been spoken about on a lot of news stations and newspapers and what you're just hearing on the street about supply chain disruptions. We're going to be covering all of that in this call. So today we are being joined by Andrew Singer. He's one of our portfolio managers here at Eventide. He's been with Eventide for quite a while as a senior analyst. He's just very entrenched in what we do, how we do it. So I'm always pleased whenever he's willing to kind of step out from his studies and what he's doing to manage our portfolios and come and say, hey, this is what's going on. This is what I'm seeing. So we're pleased to have Andy join us. Before we get going, I do want to say that we're using data in this presentation that comes from a number of different sources. We believe that these sources are true and trustworthy. However, there is no guarantee that they are. So we just want to make sure that you don't use any of this data to actually make buy or sell decisions with your investments, and to just take it as informational purposes only. So with that, let me tell you what we're going to cover. We are going to start big picture, where we're going to talk about the problem that we're hearing within supply chains. So a lot of the things that you're hearing about, hey, what does this have to do with this problem that I'm hearing? Andy's going to cover what the problem is, and then he's going to get into some of the things you may not be realizing are actually causing the problems. And this is going to be very essential. This diagnosis of what's going on in supply chain disruption will really be important. So I want you to pay attention to that part, because then we're going to see how different trends are emerging to address some of these problems. And some of these trends were existing before the problems of the last couple of years have come about and have just simply been accelerated. But some of them are new, saying, hey, these are new trends that we're seeing, or just really acutely recognized at this particular time. So Andy's going to talk about those trends, and then he's going to get a little bit more granular and actually talk about some of the types of companies that are poised to benefit from these trends that are emerging to address these problems. So with that is our agenda. So we're going to start out with this first thing, the problem. So I'll turn it over to Andy at this point, and he's going to start walking us through.
Great. Thanks, Sean. It's been a pretty wild couple of years. The supply chain is an area of the value chain and economy that a lot of people haven't had to pay much attention to over the years. And all of a sudden, we have these major problems, shortages of goods, semiconductors, raw materials, cars, shortages of labor. We've got congested ports. We have really high transportation costs. And as a result of all these shortages, we have inflation. So that is the problem. So let's move on to really what's causing this problem. And you can see from this chart, the amount of globalization has really increased significantly over the last 20 years. That's manufacturing. And really, I'll say that we were already vulnerable to supply chain issues in the US. And what I mean by that is US companies started to offshore largely to Asia in the 1980s. And this offshoring really took off in the 2000s, the early 2000s, and it really swung too far. So companies really wanted cost savings, but what they sacrificed was supply chain resilience, and they moved too far away from customers. And so it created the situation where we were really vulnerable as far as supply chain. And also here's a look at what the manufacturing jobs in the US has really plummeted over the decades. And another reason we're vulnerable is supply chains have become incredibly complicated. So if you're a US manufacturer, you may have a supplier in China. That supplier may have its own supplier in China. So now we're dealing with suppliers of suppliers. And once they actually get their act together, they ship the product overseas to the US into ports, And a lot of time there was congestion in the ports, and it took a while from the goods to get overseas through the ocean or air freight. They arrived into the ports were congested. Then you've got to get the goods from the ports to the warehouses before they get to the end customer. So you have these incredibly complex supply chains. And meanwhile, at the same time, the end consumer wants their products faster and faster. It's the Amazon effect. Everyone wants their product today or tomorrow. So we're really vulnerable. And then you can see on this next slide that, especially in some of these industries, like electronics and computers, we were really, and capital equipment, a lot of these products are now made overseas, so we have to import them into the US. And you can also see from this chart, we're especially dependent on China. And so exacerbating that situation was the China trade war, which began a few years ago and which really hasn't really resolved itself. So that just added additional pressure on our vulnerabilities in the supply chain. Just-in-time inventory management is another reason that the supply chain was already vulnerable. So I'll just describe what this means. So just-in-time inventory management is when you have your suppliers keep really low inventories. And then if you're a US manufacturer, and then the supplier sends it to the manufacturer just before they produce the product. So the goal is increased efficiency. You're receiving the goods from your supplier just before you produce, and you don't need to hold as much inventory. But basically, this is another area where companies basically swung too far. In their goal of trying to be efficient, they really sacrificed supply chain resiliency. Then you had COVID pop up, and that really caused another problem in the supply chain because remember early in COVID, plants had to shut down because of the lockdowns. And then as these plants came back up, they came back slowly because when the lockdowns ended, a lot of these companies were unsure what demand was going to look like. A lot of them were cautious. They thought the US was going to stay in a recession. But what they didn't expect was that demand came surging back. So you had a lot of stimulus from the government, and then you had a lot of interesting product areas which snapped back very quickly because they benefited from COVID. So things like laptops and computers benefited from work from home. And then tech companies did really well. So they were spending on equipment. And then you had people buying things like cleaning supplies and other products that benefited from nesting. So basically you had demand snap back really sharply, and the demand snapped back in really unpredictable ways that companies couldn't have imagined. And on top of that, you had regional variations. So some areas of the country were locked down longer than other areas of the country. So there were all these problems. And then on top of that, when you had production facilities shut down, when they bring production back online, sometimes that causes problems. And there were actually a bunch of chemical plant explosions, just as an example of this. So Ohio, Texas, Louisiana, Germany, there were plant explosions in all of those areas. And what companies don't advertise is that they hate having to bring production offline and then restart it, because it causes all sorts of problems. And that's exactly what happened right after COVID. And some of you may have been trying to order furniture over the last 2 years, and it's taken months, or if you're looking to buy a new or used car, and it's all related to all these issues of the supply chain. On top of that, you had the Texas winter storm in February of 2021. So Texas was completely unprepared, and their utilities. And so that really snarled up the supply chain, especially related to areas of production and manufacturing and chemicals, a lot of which are produced on the Gulf Coast. Then we have the whole issue of labor shortages. So this is another area where the economy was already pretty vulnerable for labor shortages. And one of the reasons for that is that a lot of manufacturing is done in these rural areas, these small towns where there's really not a lot of available labor. People are moving away. On top of that, you have a shortage of skilled manufacturing labor. A lot of people today lack trade skills, and you're seeing lower enrollment in trade schools. So they don't have the skills, the trade skills. So there was already the situation where we were pretty vulnerable as far as labor shortages. And on top of that, during COVID, you had absenteeism because people had to stay home, whether they had COVID or they were responsible for childcare for their kids that were learning from home, or if they were caring for sick family members. So that caused problems as far as getting people back to work. On top of that, you had stimulus payments by the government, which disincentivized a lot of people from going back to work. And then you've seen a shift also in worker loyalty. So workers have tended to be less loyal now. They hop around to the jobs that provide the highest pay. And there's even apps that can show workers in their region where the highest paying jobs are available that day, even if it's not a full-time job. And then the last point on the labor shortage that I'll make is you've probably heard of this concept called the Great Resignation over the last 2 years. And this goes back to people wanting a better work-life balance. So they're doing more freelancing. They're doing jobs that they're more interested in personally. And older workers have started to retire earlier than they normally would have because they've saved and really done a great job saving and can afford to retire early. So the labor shortage is really an issue which started before COVID, and now things have really gotten worse. The next point causing supply chain issues is this zero COVID policy that Asia has had in China. So China has been severely locked down in recent months. It's just started to loosen up in the Shanghai area. And this has really caused major issues because there's so much production being done in China. And if they can't get into their facilities to produce, then a lot of these US manufacturers can't get the components that they need to make the end product. Then you have the Ukraine-Russia war. So on top of all these issues, now we have one of the largest wars we've seen since World War II in Ukraine. And Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. And here you can see what a large exporter they are of things like wheat and corn. So this has really caused inflation and shortages in those areas, as well as energy. And so just another sort of data point, another factor that's causing these supply chain problems. Another problem that we've been dealing with in recent years, and COVID has made worse, is a shortage of truck drivers. So trucking is an essential part of the supply chain, getting those goods from the ports to the warehouses, from the warehouses to the stores or to the end consumer, to the manufacturing site. And we already had a shortage of truck drivers. And the reason for that is it's a very tough job. They really work in tough conditions. Many times they can find better pay in other industries. There's a lot of regulations on the number of hours that they can work. So that's a good thing as far as safety and society, but even with the same number of workers, they're restricted on the number of hours they can work. So that's another sort of issue tightening the supply chain. And then there's also stricter drug and alcohol testing policies on truck drivers. So about 2% of truck drivers, the supply has been reduced by about 2% in recent years. So again, a positive as far as society and safety with truck drivers who have been failing these tests to work, but it's just another issue that's causing supply chain issues. And we're going to talk a little bit later in the presentation about one of our holdings, Old Dominion, and they're really a problem solver in this issue. because there's enough drivers. The issue is pay. So making sure workers have the right, pay, compensation, working for a company with a great culture, and work-life balance. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. And so on top of all these issues, we have the US ports, which are congested. These ports are not efficiently run. Many of these ports are owned by cities. They're not privately run enterprises. And so they're not really well run. They haven't really been well invested in. Cities have a lot more pressing issues than thinking about the long-term strategy for their ports. So it's just another area of vulnerability, which really came to light during all these situations we've had to deal with in the last 2 years.
All right, so that is a thorough diagnosis looking into exciting. I've actually learned a lot here in the last 15 minutes, just of all of the big buzzwords that I've been hearing associated with what's causing these supply chain issues. And I'm wondering how many of those were just here in the last couple of years of unique events. And you mentioned some of those, like the COVID lockdowns in Asia, the Texas storm, the Ukraine-Russia crisis. But then there's other things that have just been building up over time. Even our reliance on globalization, which has brought many good things. However, it also leaves us vulnerable in some different ways. And so some of the key highlights that I want people to put a pin in and then be listening for in the future. You were talking about labor shortages, and then specifically with truckers, that is a particular area where we just often don't even think, like, it's almost just so obvious that those are a key part of our supply chain. But you think about the nature of a truck driver's life and their labor conditions, and how companies that are really poised to address that are really meeting an important human need for all of us as far as getting our goods. And so I thought that was very interesting. And I love how you kind of said, hey, we're going to talk about this more here in a little bit when we're talking about different companies that are addressing this. So now we're going to move to, now that we've diagnosed the problem, saying these are some of the underlying issues that are causing this, we can have a little bit clearer picture of, well, now we can see which trends need to emerge that are going to help address these things. So Andy, let's talk about some of these trends.
Sure. And here you can see now there's a general awareness of all these problems. So here you can see just the number of times companies are mentioning supply chain or having to onshore. So there's been a significant increase, which makes sense. So we're aware of the problem, and the companies themselves aren't the only ones dealing with this. The country, the US, has to be concerned about this issue. Now with all these supply chain issues, it's a matter of national security. I mean, even during COVID, we were importing PPE from China, and we're really concerned about the fact that a lot of the electronics are made in China. So even the federal government has started to get involved. And here you can see on that first line, as part of the Infrastructure Act, we've had things like funding of ports and waterways and airports. So even the government has to get involved in having to solve this issue, and which is great, because we all need to come together. But I think the companies themselves are really going to be the key problem solver on these issues. And one other area the government is working on, it hasn't passed yet, but there's a desire to bring more semiconductor manufacturing to the US, giving federal incentives. So that's an area of legislation that's still being worked on. So let's talk about onshoring. So onshoring is this concept where US companies are going to need to bring back manufacturing production into the US. So companies have recognized they've gone overboard, they're producing too much in Asia, and now we have to bring back a lot of manufacturing into the US. In addition to that, they're also going to rebalance their production. So US companies will even produce some more in Europe versus Asia, because the goal is really supply chain resiliency and being close to your customer. So just some data points on how far we've already come as far as onshoring in the last 2 years. since the beginning of 2021, the semiconductor industry has already announced nearly $80 billion in new investments in the US that are going to take place through 2025. So companies like Intel, Samsung, Texas Instruments have all announced they're going to produce in the US. Automobile companies have been increasing their investments in the US. And this is especially true of the EV battery companies, electric vehicle battery companies. A lot of medical equipment companies are starting to come back to the US. And that's also good, not just from a company standpoint, industry, but also national security, making sure we have the right medicines here in the US and don't have to rely on foreign companies and foreign countries. And I'll mention this shifting, this onshoring is not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a multi-year period. But the good news is it'll be a multi-year tailwind for a lot of companies and industries. And we'll talk about some of those companies in a little while. So another strategy companies have to deal with the supply chain issue is they're going to hold higher inventories. So the just-in-time inventory system had swung way too far. And now companies realize they have to move to more of what they call a just-in-case inventory system. So they have to prevent shortages. You don't want to be running out of products. Obviously, that means lost revenues. It means your customers are really upset with you if you can't deliver. So companies are going to have to hold more inventory. And this is this concept of just in case versus just in time. And so we'll go back to a previous slide. I don't know if you have that, Sean, of the actual companies that will benefit just before we get to, okay, we'll get some onshoring examples here. Okay, so companies that will benefit. So we've talked about all these trends coming together, and really what we're going to see about onshoring is it's going to be a positive for the economy. So we have jobs, we're going to have more job growth, wage gains, capital spending will improve in the US. So it's really going to be a positive for the US economy. And we can talk about some of the companies that we're going to look at that'll benefit. First of all, there's infrastructure companies. So basic materials, highways, water. So think about all the construction that goes in to building these new facilities in the US and then actually operating these companies after they've been built. Electrical equipment. So a lot of the equipment that goes into plants, those companies are going to benefit. Utilities. So not a lot of people think about this when they think about onshoring, but these companies that onshore are going to need a way to power their factories. And so utilities are going to benefit. Automation is another area that's going to benefit. So when companies bring back a lot of the production into the US, we're still going to be dealing with this shortage of skilled labor. And companies are going to want to still keep costs down. And on top of that, they're going to want to make sure that their workers don't have to do really manual, difficult, unsafe labor. And so automation is really a problem solver in this. So it's not about laying off workers. It's about making workers' lives better, making their work more productive, making their work safer. And it's really going to be a necessary solution because we're still going to be dealing with this shortage of skilled labor. Then we've got capital equipment. So all of the equipment that goes into the plants, and it's not really just for manufacturing. So think about medical products and life sciences research. Those are areas that are going to benefit from onshoring. And there's a lot of equipment, instrumentation that goes into those areas. So again, not just capital equipment for manufacturing, but also life sciences and medical equipment. We're going to also have transportation companies that benefit. So as transportation becomes more decentralized, as it's moving around the country, so it's not going to just be going from the port to the end customer. It's going to be going to the warehouses, and it's going to be a lot more decentralized. So there's going to need to be a lot more trucking, more complicated systems for transportation, and it's really going to benefit those companies. And then warehouses. So the desire to be closer to the customer is really going to cause more warehouses, and the companies that are well positioned are going to have those warehouses that are automated and closer to the customer. And another area that not a lot of people think about when they think about onshoring is software. So a lot of these industries that I've mentioned, there are software providers that are really helping them become more productive. So all of these industries that I've mentioned above, there's usually a software provider really enabling them to be more productive. And then another area would be educational software, software that helps with skills training. So again, the US worker, we're going to need a higher skills worker. And in many ways, that's going to be a good thing. So the unsafe, repetitive labor is going to be automated. And then those workers will transition to higher skill jobs. So there are a lot of software companies that can really help with that online training and development. And that's going to be great for employees. And there's going to be companies that help them achieve that by using that sort of software.
So this slide, we're mainly talking about like the types of companies that will benefit based off of what they actually do, the actual product or service they're providing in their industry. However, I've also heard you speak about these trends will also impact the way that every company operates. So whether or not you're actually providing your transportation company or a software company that's helping with employee training. Other industry, you might be a company in a completely different industry. However, you're having to change the way that you're operating internally to be able to adapt to some of these new trends, which is where I've heard you speak about our Business 360 framework. And so now if you'll take some time, just talk about the Business 360 framework and how you think it gives us a distinct advantage in analyzing companies and their ability to adapt.
Yeah, so as many of you realize, the Business 360 framework we have, it's really, we look for companies that create value for all stakeholders. And really it's the right way to invest. It's a great way to invest for us because we're really able to identify these companies that have sustainable competitive advantages. And a lot of these competitive advantages are really underappreciated. And Business 360 as a source of these competitive advantages. So I'll just get into some of the specifics on how our companies benefit from Business 360 and how it really positions them really well during a time like this, a challenging time like this. So the first thing I'll say is our companies are really high quality, so they have pricing power to overcome inflation. So why do they have pricing power? Well, they have innovative products and services that customers want. Customers are willing to pay for these products and services. And if our companies raise the price, the customers are willing to accept that because these products and services are essential to these customers' operations. And it's just a better product than their competitors are providing. So the first thing I'll mention is our companies have pricing power to overcome inflation. The second thing I'll mention is in this time of labor shortages, it becomes incredibly important for companies to be able to attract and retain labor. And the way our companies do this is by having a really strong culture and by benefit from offering opportunities for training and development and also strong compensation policies. So the company that really is a great example of this is Old Dominion Freight Line, which is a trucking company. So you heard me describe how there's this shortage of truck drivers, not only a shortage of truck drivers, but dock workers. So despite the shortage, the company hired over 4,000 full-time employees in the last 12 months. They increased their workforce by almost 20% during this time of shortage. And that's because these new employees were really attracted to the company's strong culture, the great work-life balance that Old Dominion provides. So most of the truck drivers are back at home every night, which is really unusual in trucking. Old Dominion offers a really competitive compensation, usually higher than its competitors. And they really also offer safer and more modern trucks than their competitors provide. So they've done a great job in being able to overcome these labor challenges. Another area where companies have really shined during this supply chain challenge is having great relationships with suppliers. So our companies really treat their suppliers like partners. It's not someone that you try and squeeze for every last dollar. It's a partner that you have a win-win situation with. And I'll give an example is we own an electrical products company called Invent Electric. Some of their relationships with suppliers span for decades, and they really treat them like partners. And this company has really done a great job in overcoming the supply chain challenges much better than competitors. And they've also, in recent years, developed a regionalized manufacturing strategy. So they started onshoring before a lot of companies started onshoring, and it's really paid off. And a couple more examples of just general things that our companies have been doing over the last 2 years because they have strong operations. One thing our companies have been doing is they've been redesigning their products. So if there's a shortage of aluminum or copper, they can go back to their R&D teams, their engineering teams, and actually re-engineer the product to be, the same or higher quality, but use less of that raw material. So it doesn't happen overnight, but in the course of a year or two, they can actually redesign their products. Another thing they can do is they can award more business to their best suppliers. So they can create a supply chain strategy, which gives the most critical work on the most critical products to their best suppliers. So our companies have really done a great job in the last 2 years, not just navigating the supply chain challenges, but they've actually gained market share because they've done a better job than competitors. And another interesting thing is a lot of our companies have seen their customer satisfaction scores increase in the last 2 years because they've done such a great job navigating these challenges of the last 2 years.
It's so interesting. A lot of times when we're talking about Business 360, people are intrigued by it because there's something internal to them that says, "Oh, this seems like the right thing to do. That the businesses, should be doing this," which I know you're passionate about. But also, as a portfolio manager and analyst, you want to make sure it's the smart thing to do. And so you're seeing these traits of businesses and how they treat their stakeholders come to fruition and saying, well, yeah, we appreciate that you're doing this from just a moral standpoint. You should be treating all of your stakeholders with the dignity they deserve. But you're also observing that, well, this is the smart thing to do also for companies. You're actually seeing companies be at an advantage through this lens. Is that right?
Exactly. It has really been, the last 2 years has really been really a proof point of the power of Business 360. So creating value for all stakeholders. Exactly. It makes sense being a smart way to invest and the right way to invest, but it's really shown, it always shows up in these times of volatility as a huge competitive advantage, which really goes under the radar. And not a lot of people would, when you're analyzing a company, you're investing in a company, would think about, how do they treat their employees or how do they treat their suppliers? But in a time like this, it's really highlighted the importance of those two aspects. And our companies have really distanced themselves from competitors at a time like this.
Whenever, because in a lot of ways, Business 360 limits our universe of investable assets. And this highlights that that's not necessarily a disadvantage because we're limiting it to the best in each industry. As we're looking at their management teams, as we're looking at how they're treating their employees, their suppliers, it's not just arbitrarily knocking investable companies out of our universe arbitrarily. It's saying, well, actually, this limits it to who we believe are actually best poised to navigate this in the future.
That's right.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's right. We're always looking for the positive aspects. So we use the negative screens, but then we do a lot of fundamental research and talking with management teams and experts in these industries. And we're asking these questions, which companies treat their employees the best? Who is the best retention? Who is the best supply chain? And it's really an area where we put increased emphasis that a lot of fundamental investors are not looking at. And so it's this underappreciated aspect of competitive advantage that is really showing up. So in addition to all the other things we do, like looking at the products that the companies make, is it innovative? Are they providing a solution to their customers? Is it a brand that customers are willing to pay for? Is it a proprietary technology? Is it a great management team? All of that stuff we're doing. And then we're taking it even a step further and looking at these other underappreciated aspects like labor and supply chain.
One principle that I noted that I think it's interesting to see the correlation here. Whenever we were talking about trends and different trends that are emerging to address these problems, some of these trends seem to be immediately expensive and inflationary, like onshoring and companies having to make more capital investments immediately, as far as, well, we're going to spend more money in the short term making these investments on maybe building out our own manufacturing facilities domestically. And the same thing is true even from a business 360 standpoint of companies making investments in their different stakeholders, kind of for the long-term benefit that it provides. But immediately, and this is where I think a lot of investors might be misled, it might be more expensive per se to invest more in your employees, and invest more in their training, in their safety, in those types of things. But what we see long term is it ends up having a positive effect on the returns long term. So it's just interesting to see the correlation between some of these trends being immediately expensive, but long term more efficient, and same thing with investment stakeholders.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, so it makes sense that onshoring would be inflationary. For example, US workers get paid more than workers in Asia, but a lot of think about all the inflation we're seeing today because the supply chain lacks resiliency, all these shortages, like that in itself is massively inflationary. So I think people are maybe thinking about it the wrong way. So yes, even though companies will have to pay higher wages and there could be some inflationary consequences of onshoring, it's much better from an overall perspective. Paying US workers is great for the US economy. We need a strong working class to have a strong economy. Also product quality. So, we should be producing more in the US. A lot of companies, when they initially did the offshoring, it was all about costs. They didn't consider things like product quality or just this risk of shortages. So there are definitely some, like you said, some near-term higher costs that we'll have to absorb from onshoring, but a lot of that will sort of filter out over time, especially as US plants become more productive, more efficient. One example of that is a lot of the active pharmaceutical ingredients are actually made in Asia because they've got these massive plants and they actually have a lot more chemists than we do in the US. As we bring that back to the US, yes, it's going to be higher costs, but eventually the US plants will scale, will have enough labor, and so the inflationary aspects will sort of peter out and we'll be way better positioned from a long-term better resiliency and better national security perspective.
Yeah, this is so interesting. And once you're exposed to understanding all the different problems and trends are emerging, you can't unsee it. So I'll go back to this slide we were showing.
Yeah, sorry,
earlier.
I skipped over that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like you're just seeing this everywhere. Now that we've exposed it, you're going to start noticing it too in all these headlines.
Yeah. So Volkswagen, right? This gigantic German company which sells to their customers all over the world. They're saying, hey, wait a second, we need to think about supply chain resiliency, shorter supply chain. So that's that concept I mentioned before, getting away from just-in-time inventory management, focusing less on China and more in the US. So this is, again, a German company that needs to think, wow, we're producing way too much in Asia. And there's some more examples we have here. Intel announcing a $20 billion plant in Ohio. So they've recognized the issue. Electric vehicle battery companies, a lot of them are relocating here to the US. And even the French sneaker and sporting goods company Salomon, where a lot of us know them from the sporting goods, the skis, the sneakers, the hiking boots. Even they're saying, we're producing way too much in China. We're going to bring back production into France. So that's definitely not ideal. They don't want to be producing in France, but it's better off from the long term. And then the aluminum plant, the aluminum company Novelis, which is going to be bringing production to Alabama. All of these companies have really realized they need to bring more production into the U.S. And we're going to see this steady stream of headlines coming in the coming years.
Well, Andy, this has been super informative. I've received a number of questions about how to get these slides. And here's how you can get the slides: eventineinvestments.com/themes slides. And if you're curious about upcoming events that we have, more of these types of webinars where we just get a little bit more granular on a particular theme, you can sign up to get notifications of when these webinars are occurring in the future, as well as other webinars that we host as a firm here at Eventide. So with this, I'll go and let us off the hook. It's about 42 minutes after, so we stay within our time frame. Andy, thank you so much for joining us. This was informative to me, and I'm sure it was informative to our audience as well. So with that, thank you for joining us, and you may now sign off the line.
Thanks, Sean.